A dump truck backed over the fence line and raised its bed, and the load came down like an avalanche. Bones, thousands of them, cattle bones and hooves, and things a person should not have to look at, sliding off the truck in a pale, reeking heap behind an old barn. The smell hit a second later, thick enough to taste. A screen door banged. A girl came running across the yard barefoot, screaming at the driver to stop. He did not stop. He dumped the load and pulled out without looking at her. The girl stood at the edge of that pile with her hand over her mouth. She was 12. Her name was Nell Carter, and she and her grandfather had 40 acres, $11, and now a mountain of bones. What that little farmer did with all of it is a story worth hearing. Stay with me. The Carter farm was 40 acres, a barn that leaned, a garden, 6 laying hens, and one old man who could not do what he used to. That was the whole of it. Nell Carter was 12 years old, and she ran most of that farm herself, because the only other person on it was her grandfather, and her grandfather was 76, and his hands did not work the way they once had. His name was Earl. Earl Carter had farmed that ground his whole life, and his father before him, and he had been a strong man once. But age is age, and a bad hip and worse hands had taken most of what Earl could do, and so a great deal of the work had quietly shifted on to a girl who was too young for it and never once said so. Nell was Earl's granddaughter, and she lived with him because there was nowhere else for her to be. Her mother, Earl's daughter, had left when Nell was small, the way some people leave, and had not come back. There was no father in the picture that anyone talked about, so it was Earl and Nell, an old man and a little girl, on 40 acres that were slowly going under. And they were going under. That is just the truth of it. The farm had never made much, and now, with Earl unable to work it hard and Nell only 12, it made almost nothing. They lived on Earl's small pension and what the garden and the hens gave them, and every year there was a little less. And every year the property taxes on those 40 acres came due whether the farm made money or not. Nell understood all of it. That is the thing about a kid raised close to the bone. She knew exactly how thin things were. She knew what the tax bill was. She knew that the truck needed work they could not pay for. She knew that her grandfather lay awake, because she heard him, and she knew he was ashamed that a 12-year-old was carrying so much, and she never once let him see that she knew, because it would have broken him. She was a good farmer, too. That is worth saying. 12 years old, and she could grow anything. Doctor a sick hen, fix a fence, run the whole garden. Her grandmother had taught her most of it before she passed. Earl's wife, Nell's grandma Ruth, dead 3 years now, a woman who had forgotten more about growing things than most people ever learn. Nell did not have a childhood other 12-year-olds had, and she had made her peace with that a long time before this story starts. The girls in her class went to things. The pool in summer, sleepovers, the pictures in town on a Saturday. Nell went home and worked, because if she didn't, an old man with a bad hip tried to do it instead, and she could not stand to watch that. She stopped being asked to things after a while, the way you do when you say no enough times, and it stung more than she ever let on. But she never once complained, and she never once told Earl how much she gave up, because he was already carrying enough shame about a little girl doing a grown man's work. So that was the Carter place. An old man, a young girl, 40 acres, and not quite enough of anything. And 2 miles down the road sat Bell Meats. Bell Meats was a big commercial slaughterhouse and packing plant, a serious operation, the largest employer in the county. It processed cattle by the thousands, and it was owned by a man named Roy Bell, who had a fine house on the hill and a seat on the county commission, and who had never in his life spoken to Earl Carter. And a plant that size is a problem, which is where this story really begins. Because when you process that many animals, you are left with an enormous quantity of what the trade politely calls byproduct: bones, hooves, trim and waste, and parts nobody buys. And by law, that material has to be disposed of properly, hauled to a licensed rendering plant, which charges by the ton, month after month after month. For an operation the size of Bell Meats, doing it right costs real money. So somebody at Bell Meats had found a way to spend less. There was a stretch of low, useless ground on the back of the Carter place, up against the county road, screened from view by the barn, easy to back a truck to, out of sight, and it belonged to an old man and a little girl who had no money no lawyer, and no way in the world to make trouble for anybody. The first time it happened, Earl called the plant. A woman took a message. Nobody called back. The second time, Earl drove down there himself and stood at a counter for half an hour and was finally told by a man who never looked up that Bell Meats did not dump waste on private land, that he was mistaken, and that if he had a complaint, he could put it in writing. He put it in writing. Twice. Nothing. By the time Nell Carter stood barefoot at the edge of a mountain of bones with her hand over her mouth, it had happened 9 times in 3 months, and it was destroying them. The smell in summer was so bad, they kept the windows shut in the heat. The 2 neighbors who used to buy eggs and vegetables stopped coming. You could not stand in that yard. The low ground went foul, and the flies came, and the whole place took on the stink of death. Earl called everyone he could think of. The county, where Roy Bell sat on the commission. The state. Each of them told him some version of the same thing, which was that it was a civil matter, and he would need a lawyer and testing and documentation. And did he have $20,000 to go up against Bell Meats? He did not have 200. So there it was. A big company was using their land as a boneyard because it was cheaper than doing it right, and there was not one single thing an old man and a 12-year-old could do about it. That is what everyone said. Nell stood out there that evening, 12 years old, looking at that reeking white mountain that was killing her family's farm, and she thought about her grandmother. Grandma Ruth had been dead 3 years, but Nell heard her voice in her head most days, usually saying something practical about dirt. And there was one thing Ruth had said that came back to Nell now, standing at the edge of that pile, word for word. Ruth had never in her life bought a bag of fertilizer. She thought it was foolishness, paying for a sack of something you could make. And every fall, when they cleaned out after butchering a hog or when bones came in hand, Ruth would save them and burn them and grind them and work the result into her garden beds. And her garden was the best in the county, and everybody knew it. And when they asked her secret, she always said the same thing. Bones, honey, there's no fertilizer on God's earth richer than ground bone. Folks throw away the best thing they've got. Nell stood in the stink with those words in her head, and she turned around and looked at that mountain of bones with completely different eyes. She went and found Earl on the porch. Grandpa, she said, the bones are dumping. Grandma used to make fertilizer out of bones. Earl looked at her tiredly. Your grandmother made a lot of things, Nellie. That's a few buckets of bone she was grinding. That out back is 40 tons of slaughterhouse waste. It's not the same. But it is the same, Nell said. It's just more. Bone meal is bone meal. She said it was the richest fertilizer there is. And there's a mountain of it out there, and they're going to keep bringing more, and everybody's telling us it's garbage. She sat down next to him. What if it isn't garbage, Grandpa? What if they've been dumping money in our field for 3 months? Earl opened his mouth to tell her it wasn't that simple, and then he stopped because his wife had made the finest bone meal fertilizer he had ever seen for 50 years, and he had watched her do it 1,000 times, and the honest truth was that the girl was not wrong about what bones are. She was only wrong about how easy it would be, which is a different kind of wrong. Nell, he said slowly, even if you could make it, and it's filthy, hard, hot work, and there's a right way and a lot of wrong ways. Even if you made it, who's going to buy fertilizer from a 12-year-old? Gardeners, Nell said. Same people who bought Grandma's eggs. And Grandma's got a book. They found it that night. Ruth's garden book, a fat water-stained ledger full of 40 years of the old woman's cramped handwriting, planting dates and weather notes, and in the back, page after page on soil and compost, and yes, on bone. How to clean it, how to burn it down, how to grind it, how much to work into a bed. Little notes in the margins going back decades. Nell Carter read those pages by lamplight until she fell asleep with the book open on her chest. And then she started making fertilizer. I will be honest with you, because this is not the kind of story where a child has a clever idea and it works the first week. It did not work. The first months were awful. Cleaning slaughterhouse bone is a horrible job, and Nell did it in the summer heat with the flies, hauling and boiling and scrubbing, and more than once she was sick from the smell of it. Her first attempt at burning the bone down were a disaster. Too little and it rotted, too much and it turned to useless ash. She had no grinder worth a name, and wrecked her hands trying to break bone by hand. She cried once, out of pure exhaustion, and then wiped her face and went back to it, because that field was not getting any smaller. But she used her grandmother's book, and she kept notes the way Ruth had, and slowly, she worked it out. Here is the thing about learning craft from a dead woman's notebook. Half of what Ruth knew was never written down, because it lived in her hands, and Nell had to find all of it again by feel. Ruth's book said to burn the bone, till it goes light and crumbles, and Nell had to ruin a dozen batches before she understood in her body what light and crumbles meant. It said to grind it fine as cornmeal, and she had to build a thing that could do it. Nobody was there to show her. She was 12, and she did it after school and after chores in the heat, alone, with her grandfather watching from the porch wishing his hand still worked. She figured out the burning. She rigged a grinder out an old feed mill Earl had in the barn and got it turning. And the first time a stream of fine gray bone meal came out the bottom of it, she stood there and watched it like it was gold. She tested it on the garden first. And that fall, the Carter garden came in so hard and so heavy that even Earl, who had seen his wife's gardens for 50 years, went quiet looking at it. "That's Ruth's dirt," he finally said. "You made Ruth's dirt." Nell bagged up what she'd made in used feed sacks, printed a label by hand, Carter's bone meal, Ruth's recipe, and took it to the farmer's market in town. She sold out by 10 in the morning. Gardeners are particular people, and word among them moves fast. And the word was that the Carter girl was selling old-fashioned burning ground bone meal, the real thing, the kind you could not buy in a store anymore. She had 6 people asking for more the first day. One woman who ran a big commercial greenhouse operation took a bag to try and asked for Nell's number. Nell wrote it on a scrap of feed sack. That woman called on Monday. She wanted 200 pounds a month, and that is how Nell Carter, 12 years old, went into the fertilizer business. The next several months were the best that farm had seen in years. Nell processed bone every day after school and all weekend. The mountain behind the barn, which had been a curse, became her whole supply, free raw material, delivered by the truckload, by the very people trying to ruin her. Earl, who had spent years watching the farm die, found himself doing something he had not done in a long time, which was help. His hands could still label bags and keep books, and he did, at the kitchen table, proud as anything. For the first time since Ruth died, the numbers came out right. They paid the tax bill early. They fixed the truck. And the dumping even stopped that fall. The trucks quit coming, and Nell figured somebody at Bell had finally read one of Earl's letters or changed a route. The pile she was steadily grinding down, and the ground behind the barn began slowly to clear. For about 2 months, it was the happiest that house had been since Grandma Ruth passed. Then, on a cold morning in November, a car came up the drive that did not belong to anyone they knew. The man who got out wore a suit and carried an envelope, and he was a lawyer for Bell Meats. What he handed Earl Carter on his own porch did 3 things. It informed him that any material Bell Meats had placed on the Carter property remained the legal property of Bell Meats. It demanded that the Carters immediately cease removing, processing, or selling any product derived from that material. And it stated that Bell Meats would be sending trucks to recover its property, and that any further sale of product derived from Bell Meats byproduct would be met with legal action. In plain words, stop making your fertilizer, and we are coming to take the bones back. The lawyer was very polite. He said Mr. Bell would prefer to resolve this amicably. He mentioned that Bell might be willing to make a fair offer for the 40 acres, given the family situation. Then he got in his car and left. And everything changed, because up to that morning, this had been a story about a stink behind a barn, a wrong you had to live with. Now it was a company with a legal department deciding that a 12-year-old's fertilizer was a problem, and moving to shut her down and take the land while they were at it. Now, if you've been rooting for Nell the way I have, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button, because what this 12-year-old girl did next is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story. Now stay with me. Earl sat down at the kitchen table with that letter and put his head in his hands, and Nell watched her grandfather look older than she had ever seen him. "They can't do that," Nell said. "They dumped it. They said it was garbage. Now it's theirs. They can say whatever they want, Nellie," Earl said. "That's what it means to be them and us to be us." He looked up and his eyes were wet. "We can't fight a company like Bell. A lawyer to even answer this letter is money we don't have. And here is where 12-year-old Nell Carter asked a question that turned the whole thing around. "Grandpa," she said slowly, "why do they even care?" Earl blinked. "What?" "We make bone meal and feed sacks. They kill thousands of cows. We're nothing to them." She sat down across from him. "So, why does Bellmead send a lawyer about us? Why does Roy Bell even know our name?" They sat there in that kitchen a moment, and then Earl Carter said very quietly, "Because we got their bones." That was it. That was the whole thing. Nell's little business had done something nobody at Bell expected. It had made the Carter farm visible. A farm nobody had heard of was suddenly at the market every week, in the county paper, selling to a commercial greenhouse, with people asking who they were. Bell had spent 3 months quietly dumping waste on a farm they assumed would just go broke and vanish. Instead, that farm had a name now and a business, and this was the part that mattered. It had, sitting behind its barn, several tons of Bellmead's own slaughter waste. Evidence. Physical, testable evidence of exactly what Bell had been dumping and how much and where. A bankrupt farm sold at auction tells no stories. A thriving one, sitting on a mountain of your bones, is a different matter entirely. Nell stood up. "Grandpa," she said, "where are your letters?" Earl had kept every one. Carbon copies of every complaint dated going back 3 months. He had the dates of 9 dumping incidents in a notebook by the phone. And Nell had something better, which nobody knew about, because nobody thinks about what a 12-year-old with a cheap phone is doing. Nell had video. 7 times from a hayloft. She had filmed those trucks backing up to the fence line and dumping. Clear footage, the truck, the Bellmead's name on the door, the load coming down, the date and time on every file. She had been filming them since August, because her Grandma Ruth had always said if a thing was worth complaining about, it was worth having proof of. And there was one more thing. Because Nell had been processing those bones for months, cleaning them, sorting them. She had noticed something a person only notices if they handle material by hand. Some of those bones were wrong. Marked. There were carcass parts in that pile stamped with condemned tags. The marks a meat inspector uses on an animal that is diseased, that has failed inspection, that is by law never supposed in the food chain, or be handled as ordinary waste. Nell hadn't known what the marks meant, but she thought they were strange, and being Ruth's granddaughter, she had set a box full of the strangest ones aside in the barn. She showed Earl the box, and Earl Carter, who had butchered livestock his whole life, went very still, because he knew exactly what those marks were. "Nellie," he said quietly, "this isn't just dumping. They've been getting rid of condemned stock out here, on our land." He looked up at her. "That's not a lawsuit. That's the kind of thing that shuts a plant down." Nell looked at the box, and then at the mountain of bones behind the barn, and then at her grandfather. "I don't think we're the ones in trouble," she said. "They did not hire a lawyer, because they could not afford one. What they did instead was simpler, and it worked far better." Nell and Earl took everything, the letters, the log, the videos, and that box of condemned tag bone, not to the county, where Roy Bell sat on the commission, but to the state. 2 agencies, in fact, because a girl who reads her grandmother's careful notes had learned to be thorough. They went to the State Environmental Agency about the illegal dumping, and they went to the State Department of Agriculture about the condemned carcasses, because handling a diseased slaughter stock is not an environmental squabble. It is a public health matter, and there is nothing on this earth a meatpacking plant is more afraid of. The woman who took the report watched about a minute of Nell's video, then looked in the box, then asked them both to please wait while she got her supervisor. They waited 2 hours. Earl kept apologizing to Nell for dragging her all that way, certain they were about to be handed a pamphlet and shown the door, because that is what happened every other time he had asked anyone for help. Nell just sat with the box on her lap and did not say anything, because she had learned from a young age that the quiet ones get taken more seriously than the loud ones, and she had decided on the drive up that she was going to be very quiet and very sure. Then several people came out, and one of them was an inspector, and he looked in that box for a long time and asked Nell exactly where the material had come from and whether she would sign a statement, and whether there was more on the property. There was a great deal more of it on the property. That was rather the point. Because here is what Bellmead's lawyers had never had to worry about before, dealing with old men and little girls. Illegal dumping is a regulatory violation with fines per incident, but improper disposal of condemned, diseased carcasses is something else entirely. It triggers a mandatory health investigation, an inspection of the entire plant, and a very hard look at where else that condemned material might have gone. It is precisely the kind of thing that can close a slaughterhouse for good. The state opened an investigation within days. Inspectors came out to the Carter farm and to Bell Meats both, and what they found in the plant's records, once they knew to look, was worse than anyone outside the company had guessed. Roy Bell had been cutting corners on condemned stock disposal for years, because doing it right was expensive, and dumping it on a broke old man's backfield was cheap and quiet. It all came apart fast after that, and Nell did the other thing, too, the thing that made sure it could not be swept under a rug. She did not go quiet. She was 12 years old, and she stood at her folding table at the farmer's market, and when people asked how she got into making bone meal, she told them the truth, that the big plant had been dumping slaughter waste behind her barn, and her grandma always said bones are the richest fertilizer there is. So she started making it, and that some of those bones had turned out to be things that never should have left that plant. That story went exactly the way you would expect. The county paper ran it, then a city paper, then a television segment with a photograph of a 12-year-old girl in barn boots standing in front of Grinder, under a headline about the farm kid who turned a slaughterhouse's cover-up into a business. The investigation concluded the following spring. Bell Meats was hit with substantial fines for illegal dumping and for the improper handling of condemned material. There was a mandated cleanup and full remediation of the Carter property at Bell's expense. Every bone hauled off and the ground restored, done properly, paid for by the people who had fouled it. Roy Bell resigned from the county commission that summer, and there was a settlement negotiated between Bell's lawyers and a state that was in no mood at all, that compensated the Carter farm for 3 months of contamination and the loss of their land. Earl Carter cried when he saw the number. It was more money than that farm had seen in 20 years. But here is the part Nell is proudest of, and it is a strange one. She asked, as part of the settlement, that she be allowed to keep buying bone from Bell Meats. Legally, properly, under contract, the clean material only, because by then she had customers in a real business, and she needed the raw material, and Bell Meats now had every reason on earth to dispose of its byproduct through a nice, quiet, legal arrangement that kept a certain 12-year-old happy and not talking to reporters. Roy Bell signed it. He did not have a choice. The company that had dumped its garbage on her to be rid of it now paid to have that same material hauled to her door, cleaned and legal, so she could turn it into gold. And Nell took the settlement money and did the only thing she ever seriously considered doing with it. She built a real fertilizer works. Carter's Bone Meal, Ruth's recipe crossed 6 figures in sales the year Nell turned 15. It is not a big company. It is an old man, a girl, 2 hired hands, a proper processing shed, and a contract for clean bone from a slaughterhouse that is now scrupulously careful about where its waste goes. But it moves real product to greenhouses and nurseries and gardeners across 3 states, and it made, that year, more money than the Carter farm had made in the previous 20 combined. The tax bill on the 40 acres has not been a worry since Nell was 13. Earl framed the year. They paid the mortgage clear and hung it in the kitchen next to a photograph of a woman in a straw hat kneeling in the best garden in the county. The low ground behind the barn is grass again. Good grass. Better than before, because the remediation crew was thorough and Bell paid for every dollar of it. Nell keeps a few beds back there now. Worked heavy with her own bone meal, and they come in every year like something out of a story. She says it is her favorite spot on the whole farm. She likes to stand in the exact place where she stood at 12, barefoot, with her hand over her mouth, looking at a mountain of bones and $11 to the family name. Earl Carter lived to see all of it, which he said was more than an old man had any right to ask. He worked the books of that company from a chair in a warm shed until he could not anymore, and he told anyone who would listen that his granddaughter was the smartest person he had ever known, and that his wife Ruth had taught her everything and would have burst with pride, and both of those things were true. Nell got asked to speak, once the story got out, at 4-H banquets and farm programs, and once at a state small farms conference where she was by 20 years the youngest person there. And she always says a version of the same thing. She says the plant did not make a mistake by dumping on her farm, not from their side of it. It was a perfectly good decision, right up until it wasn't. And the reason it worked for 3 months is the same reason it works everywhere it happens. Because they picked somebody they were sure would never fight. An old man, a little girl, a farm on its last legs. Nobody with a lawyer, nobody with a voice, nobody with a moment's worry. They weren't wrong that we were small, Nell says. They were wrong that small means you'll stay quiet. And then she tells him the other thing. The thing she got from a woman in a straw hat who died when Nell was 9 and left behind a fat water-stained book full of everything she knew. Bones aren't garbage. Bones are the richest thing in the field. Folks throw away the best thing they've got. Nell Carter says she thinks about that a lot more broadly now than she did at 12, because she has come to believe that most of what the world hauls off and dumps out of sight, the waste, the failing farm, the old man everybody's written off, the kid nobody's counting on, is not garbage at all. It is just something valuable that nobody has bothered to look at the right way yet. Her grandmother knew that. Her grandmother wrote it down. And a 12-year-old girl, standing barefoot at the edge of a reeking mountain on the worst morning of her life, remembered it. That is the whole story. A company dumped its bones behind a little farmer's barn because they were certain she was nobody. She turned it into a livelihood, a paid-off farm, a state investigation, and a business with her grandmother's name on every bag. And she never once had to leave home to do it.